Hello, everyone. My name is Ken Nab, and as you probably know, we're discussing this new book of mine called The Joy of Revolution and Related Texts. We're in our second meeting now. So I'm just going to start out by sort of giving a little outline of what we're reading chapter 3. So we'll know where we go, and then we can go through the subchapters and get to specific questions and topics. So we started out last meeting reading the first two chapters. The first chapter was kind of a general introduction about the topic of revolution. And the second chapter was various topics of radical tactics. And specifically, it was like radical tactics under, quote, ordinary circumstances, normal circumstances, like when nothing, business as usual. And under those circumstances, things are not on the verge of change. They're, going along in so-called normal ways, even though the normal way may be pretty screwed up. And so people have different options, like do they work for electoral politics changes, or do they start affinity groups or alternative institutions? Do they form little radical groups? What does the radical group do? What are the different kind of tactics, like to subvert people or arouse people or whatever? And in each case, I give examples like, well, this has some positive features and it has some limitations or drawbacks. So now in this chapter 3, we're in a different context. The chapter is called Climaxes, but what it's actually about what I call radical situations as opposed to normal conditions. And radical situations, I start out like saying, what causes these things to happen? Usually you're in the business as usual thing, but once in a while something just jumps in there. And it can be caused by a variety of means. And I mention, some of the things that come up that arouse people to get together or something. And then having done that for a few pages, I end up, but social crises involve so many imponderables that it is rarely possible to predict them, much less provoke them. You can't just, I don't have a formula for how you would generate that kind of thing. In general, it seems best to pursue projects we are personally most drawn to, while trying to remain aware enough to quickly recognize significant new developments, such as dangers, urgent tasks, or favorable opportunities that call for new tactics. Meanwhile, we can move on to examine some of the crucial stages in radical situations once they do get started. So the next chapter is called, a subchapter is called Effervescence of Radical Situations. And I'm going to go through the chapter here, and then we'll come back to that. So first, I talk about what radical situations are, give examples of them, what they're like, and so on. And then popular self-organization, like if you're in such a situation, how do you organize yourself? And we've seen various things that people come up with under those circumstances. In many cases, they're improvised. In other cases, there are existing organizations that go through radical changes because people say, well, now we have a chance to do something different. And then I give as an exemplary example the situationists in May 1968. That was really a radical situation. And what did they do in it? And then I kind of step back and I have a subchapter called Workerism is obsolete, but workers' position remains pivotal. And there I'm talking about, well, what about these traditional things about the workers and about strikes and this or that? Is that obsolete? Or if it isn't obsolete, have circumstances changed where, whatever. So I talk about that for a little while. And then that segues into further things, wildcats and sit-downs, where I go into those kind of strikes, and then consumer strikes, which i.e. that's just another name for a boycott, basically. And then another subchapter, what could have happened in May 1968. I go back to that and go into more detail about what the situationists were trying to do and what the options were. And then methods of confusion and cooption, where in other words, I'm looking at things from the angle of the system. How does the system react to these things? Well, it reacts by sucking people into this or distracting them over in this or various things like that. So I mentioned some of those things. And another one, terrorism reinforces the state. And this is just a brief chapter, but I reiterate, as the title might indicate, that terrorism under virtually all circumstances is not productive of radical results, even though it seems like, oh, this is the most extreme way that you can respond to something. And then subchapter, the ultimate showdown. And this is where things come to a pitch where everything is at stake. And I give an extreme example of that, the film Potemkin, where we'll get there later on. And then the last subchapter is internationalism, where I talk about, okay, if you make a thing over here, what about the rest of the world? Well, you have to connect that up. So I'm going to go back now near the beginning of the chapter for this subchapter, Effervescence of Radical Situations, and read a couple pages to give you a little flavor. A radical situation is a collective awakening. At one extreme, it may involve a few dozen people in a neighborhood or workplace. At another, it shades into a full-fledged revolutionary situation involving millions of people. It is not a matter of numbers, but of open-ended public dialogue and participation. The incident at the beginning of the 1964 free speech movement, the FSM in Berkeley, is a classic and particularly beautiful example. As police were about to take away an arrested civil rights activist on the university campus in Berkeley, a few students sat down in front of the police car. It was spontaneous, by the way. Within a few minutes, hundreds of others spontaneously followed their example, surrounding the car so it could not move. For the next 32 hours, the police car roof was turned into a platform for freewheeling debate. That's 32 hours nonstop. The May 1968 occupation of the Sorbonne in France created an even more radical situation by drawing in much of the non-student Parisian population. The workers' occupation of factories throughout France then turned it into a revolutionary situation. In such situations, people become much more open to new perspectives, readier to question previous assumptions, quicker to see through the usual cons. Every day, some people go through experiences that lead them to question the meaning of their lives. But during a radical situation, practically everybody does so at the same time. When the machine grinds to a halt, the cogs themselves begin wondering about their functions. Bosses are ridiculed, orders are ignored, separations are broken down, personal problems are transformed into public issues. Public issues that seemed distant and abstract become immediate practical matters. The old order is analyzed, criticized, satirized. People learn more about society in a week than in years of academic social studies or leftist so-called consciousness raising. Long repressed experiences are revived. Everything seems possible, and much more is possible. People can hardly believe what they used to put up with in the old days. Even if the outcome is uncertain, the experience is often seen as worthwhile for its own sake. Here are some May 68 graffitis. If we only have enough time, ... unquote. To which a couple other graffitis responded on the same wall, in any case, no regrets. And another one, already 10 days of happiness, unquote. As work comes to a halt, rat race commuting is replaced by leisurely circulation, passive consumption by active communication. Strangers strike up lively discussions on street corners. Debates continue round the clock, new arrivals constantly replacing those who depart for other activities or to try to catch a few hours of sleep, though they are usually too excited to sleep very long. Everything, let's see here. One of the main purposes of the present text is to point out, that's Joy of Revolution, is to point out certain typical recurring patterns so that people can be prepared to recognize and exploit such opportunities before it's too late. Radical situations are the rare moments when qualitative change really becomes possible. Far from being abnormal, they reveal how abnormally repressed we usually are. They make our so-called normal life seem like sleepwalking. Yet, of the vast number of books that have been written about revolutions, few have much to say about such moments. So I'll end there and see if any of you have any questions or comments on what I just read or about some of the earlier things in the point which I didn't quote, about how these things start. You can raise your digital hand and then I'll see you. Yes, Mike.
I've been in those situations about 5 times in my life, so I can testify that they do occur, but they inevitably always dissipate, and and back to a normality. Um, I can enumerate the ones I've been through, but I won't. But what I found was missing from all of those was what you put in Joy of Revolution. Um, that the question, here it is. The point is not to romanticize wage laborers who not surprisingly, considering that the spectacle is designed above all to keep them deluded, are often the most ignorant and reactionary sectors of society. Nor is it a matter of scoring points on who is the most oppressed. All forms of oppression must be contested, and everyone can contribute to this contestation: women, youth, unemployed, minorities, lumpens, bohemians, peasants, middle classes, even renegades from the ruling elite. But none of these groups can achieve a definitive liberation without abolishing the material foundation of all these oppressions, the system of commodity production and wage labor. And this abolition can be achieved only through collective self-abolition of wage laborers. They alone have the leverage not only to directly bring the whole system to a stop, but to start up again in a fundamentally different way. Now, I think that that's absolutely correct. But the problem is that women, youth, unemployed minorities, lumpens, and the rest of the identity politics types do not have that consciousness about abolishing wage labor, or even the question of what wage labor is and how it relates to their own situations as oppressed, shall we say, or repressed or unfree. So I think that is why you get all of these revolts happening. And believe me, I've been in these situations where whole uh, towns have been shut down, literally shut down. People have actually occupied the main thoroughfares from San Francisco to Palo Alto. I remember this El Camino thing, and also it happened in East Lansing. The cops were standing on the roofs of buildings with shotguns. I've seen the whole thing, but then about 10, 15 days later, everybody goes back to normal. So that's all I wanted to say. Thank you very much for allowing me to say it.
Thanks. Yeah, what Mike brings up there, of course, is one of the key points that doesn't have any easy solution. But in other words, this is posing, when I talk about the ultimate showdown and this kind of stuff, it is exactly that. And the question, it's not easy to say, like I say, there's not a formula for getting there, but we need to be aware that when that kind of thing comes up, that's one of the key leverages that are at issue. And but anyway, do we have some other questions or comments? Somebody else? Yes, Stuart.
Yes, you can hear me this time, right?
Yes, right.
Okay. I was when I especially read that, and now you read it again about those particular examples you gave. I'm wondering what you can tell us about the way those situations were set up beforehand that made it propitious for them to take off the way they did. Because I mean, I'm sure that there's activists who've sat in front of police cars before, but not everybody sits around them. Or, for example, the other one in Paris, you had, even though, you're living in a consumer, period of relative, ease, I guess, compared to, it wasn't like a national crisis going on at that moment. There were still all of those political movements that had made people aware of wage, labor, and there were communist movements, there were left-wing movements, even though they might have been Stalinist and, controlled, there was that consciousness was there. How much of that consciousness being already there in enough people do you think is critical to having these things spontaneously happen?
Yeah. Well, again, you can't just say you need X amount of consciousness. I mean, there are times like in the Spanish Revolution, which we've talked about before last year and so on. You had another case where some of those workers and peasants in Spain had decades of education. Like they were in anarchist labor unions and stuff like this. They didn't need anybody to convince them. And then you have other situations where people have practically zero background, and yet they come up with, they're improvising, and sometimes they improvise cleverly. like they just see, oh, that's the problem. What are we going to do about that? And without knowing exactly what they're doing, they come up with a means of organization that addresses something that they see, and that may inspire other people, and then it can snowball. So I'm saying, again, in this book, I'm trying to say, here is this domain or this area of radical possibilities, and let's look at some of the things that have happened. And in some cases, we can see that was a good tactic. We might be able to use that again here. So in others, we can say that definitely was not a good tactic. It led to some kind of totalitarian thing or whatever. And then there's a mixture where we have to just sort of examine, how did that strike work out, or that insurrection, or whatever it may have been, and see what seems to work, and then pass that on, like discuss it among ourselves and publicly and so on. And that's what a lot of, well, it's what people have done for the last couple centuries, really. And what I was trying to sum up in this book, rather briefly, but one thing, the very after the next chapter after that radical situation, it's called Popular Self-Organization. And here are a few things that I point out, like you're in such a situation, how do you organize? And so I say during the 60s, it was widely felt that the best way to foster such demassification, where you're thinking for yourself rather than just being a pawn, was to form affinity groups, small associations, blah, blah, blah. And I point out, I said, yeah, that's a good idea, but those things are also pretty limited. It sounds kind of cool, but you may not be able to or may not want to organize your life around, 10 people or something in your neighborhood or your friends. And even if you do, that's a small thing. So you can't just extrapolate that everybody should form affinity groups. Like back in the 60s, a lot of people said, yeah, go out and form affinity groups. That's the way. Well, not necessarily, in some ways it may just be boring and, not accomplish anything. It just depends on the circumstance. If my general suggestion is go for what you feel like. So if you like a certain group of people, yeah, hang around with them, organize, help each other, mutual aid, blah, blah, blah. But don't just assume that that's the magic thing, because that may have nothing to do with how something like May 68 happens. And then I'm saying sooner or later, you're going to have to go more large scale than just a dozen people. And so then I said, one of the simplest ways for a large gathering to begin organizing itself, say you've got a large crowd there, but there's, it's 500 people, but, who's in charge here? Who could, I say, one of the simplest ways is for those who have something to say to line up or sign up, with each person allowed a certain time within which they can talk about anything they want. And interestingly enough, two of these radical situations came up with spontaneously. The Sorbonne Assembly and the FSM gathered around the police car, each established a 3-minute limit. That was just a coincidence. For people to do that. And so, like in the case of the police car, they said, okay, here we are on top of the police car. Line up, who wants to talk first? And then somebody comes on top and talks for 3 minutes. And then is it, I think we ought to do blah, blah, blah. Next person, no, I think we ought to do something. This is how you get started when there's no pre-established agenda. So that's what they did at that point. And in the case of that, they had 32 straight hours of that. So they had time to get into all sorts of debates about nuances, what they wanted to do, and so on. So in the Sorbonne occupation, they had even more people in a big room, auditorium or something like that, and that went on more or less continuously for several days. But again, once they do that, it's not like just to talk, that's the starting point. Like you have different people proposing things, and then after, it may be that one of those people will propose, let's do blah, blah, blah. Let's, vote on whether blah, 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 or something, and maybe people say, yeah, let's go for that. And so you kind of weed out the things that didn't seem appropriate by most people, and you narrow it down. And then when you've narrowed it down, part of what you're determining is who's with us and who's not, who's in this. So it may be that somebody says, I propose that some of us go over here and do such and such. Meet me out in the hall in 10 minutes if you want to do that. So then that guy goes over there and some people go. And then meanwhile, somebody else says, I propose that we establish some, chairmanship or some kind of way that we organize this meeting. And then different people say, well, how would we do, so you've got, this is a chaotic situation, but it's almost inevitable. That's the first thing to do is who are we? Who's in this? And what do we want? What are we going to try to do? And so the same thing can happen in the middle of a strike. You're on a strike, but then the question is, well, what now? Well, then the striking people, if they're Wildcats striking, say, well, let's see, maybe we can occupy this factory or we can do da-da-da. Whatever it is, that's a starting point. So I have a couple pages about, how those things were. I give examples how the FSM ended up working from this completely open-ended start where nobody had any plans whatsoever. They come up with these things like, well, let's have a committee of people who are going to organize the food. Here for the FSM, they called them centrals. They were like committees that were to coordinate printing, press releases, legal assistance, rustling up food, speaker systems, other necessary supplies, to locate volunteers who had indicated their skills and availability for different tasks. Phone trees made it possible to contact over 20,000 students on short notice. Those are the kind of things that the FSM came up with in a few days, just because they needed to come up with something. And so, you can imagine there was a lot of chaotic stuff, but basically they got things done. I mean, you get these things like the phone trees. This is pre-internet and all this kind of thing. You arrange these things where 10 people call 10 other people each, and those people call 10 other, and within, half an hour, you've called 20,000 people to say, urgent, show up at such and such a place. So anyway, that's just an example of some of the things that I go into in that next subchapter. But now, Britt. You're still muted. There you go.
At the FSM, there were large crowds before the police cars showed up. I mean, several thousand people in the square for several days with faculty interaction and different professors joining in before it got down to the crunch of police. So things were actually well underway by the time the famous police car incident.
Uh-huh.
But spontaneity and serendipity do have a part, as you're pointing out in your book, in breaking through.
Yeah. Lisa.
Hi there. I was just thinking about this, and this is all pretty new to me. But it seems like there's a kind of patience that you're advocating for, that it's incremental, it's slow, it's reactive in the sense that situation occurs and people get together. But how does that play out now in the day and age of social media? I mean, have you given any thought that, and the disintermediation of information too? It seems like, based on what you've said, a lot of these movements, what was critical is proximity and social interaction. But we have this kind of divisive force at work that is radicalizing us to the right. So I just wondered if you gave any thought, or if I'm, stating the obvious, and but I'm just wondering if there's something different in our current context.
Yeah, for sure. And I'll give you one example. If we had had the internet, or even if we had had, like in May 68, if they had even had cell phones widely used, May 68 might have won. I mean, there was that
Arab
much
Spring.
of a difference. In other words, in May 68, you had these workers of factories. I mean, 11 million workers occupying factories all over France, pretty much every main factory in every main city. But although they had done it against the unions, I mean, the unions didn't want this to happen. Nevertheless, the unions sort of managed to weasel their way to say, like, oh, okay, yeah, we're occupying our factory. Now let's, so as if the unions had been the leaders, and you should now look to the union leaders to tell you what happens next. And one of the things that the union leaders did is they made sure that the factory gates were locked and nobody could get in or out. And so what that meant, there were people coming from the Sorbonne or even from other factories that would go to another factory, and they would have liked to go in and talk with the fellow workers there, and they weren't allowed in. So that, in other words, if you were in a factory, you were depending on the union bureaucrats to tell you what was going on outside. And so when it got sort of near the crunch point, those union people would tell the workers, the other factories have gone back to work. So we think that we ought to do that too.
Mm.
And if you're in that factory, you say, oh gosh, I guess nothing else to do, we lost, or it's over, or the next stage is in other hands. It's and people in the neighboring factory are getting the same message about the first factory. They're saying, oh, those people in that first factory have all gone back to work. And if you wanted to confirm this, you call up the factory, and who do you get? The union office. It tells me, no, we got everything under control here. Don't blah, blah, blah. Now imagine if a bunch of workers had had cell phones back then, to say nothing of the internet and so on. And Jacques calls Rene and his friend in the neighboring factory, says, hey, what's happening over there? Oh, well, we just did. Oh, that's interesting. Maybe we could try that. you know, and well, wait a minute, we just heard that you guys were going back to work. He said, what? Bullshit, who told you that? You know, we're about ready to kick out our union people. So if something like that happened now, the internet or even just cell phones and stuff like that would mean that a lot of those communication issues would be obsolete. I mean, we could instantly communicate with people. The downside, as you mentioned, is that all this social media kind of things also have been a huge disruptive thing where you can't tell what's true or something, you know, all that. So that's another matter I don't want to even go into here, except just to say, yes, the situation in those days about 60 years ago, the communication was much more primitive. So right now we've got things better communication by far, but also a more confusingly globally dominated thing. Judy. You're still muted. Okay.
I've said this before to, in these discussions. I think you're way too hard on the unions. The unions are organizations that were created by working people, and God knows they're not perfect, but I don't think they're the main factor, and I don't think they were probably the main factor in 68.
They
Main factor, okay, let me finish. The main factor is the money. The money has got to be stopped because in all these uprisings, the more current ones, the uprising in Egypt, all that, the Arab Spring, all that was really important, but everybody went back to the usual because the people still had the money. It's the money that's got to be
and how
stopped.
are you going to take away the money from people?
Well, that's what we got to figure out. I mean,
well, there's one very simple way is like you if workers control the factories like they potentially did in May 68, then having a lot of money is meaningless.
well, yes, nowadays you
The
have,
fact is, Judy, in May 68, there was one number one enemy of the occupations movement, and it was the unions. This isn't a question about being pro or con. It's a fact that the unions were what sabotaged it. I mean, if you had asked the workers, do you want revolution or de Gaulle, they would have said revolution. But if you say, okay, we're in the factories, what are we going to do now? And like I say, you have this communication blockage. I mean, I'm talking about what's happened in history. I wish it wasn't the case. It would be much easier if unions were the natural place to go, but that for more than 100 years, they haven't.
well, they still could transform themselves.
They could. That's right. That's right.
I'm
They
not
could,
saying
but that's just like you could say a politician could get elected and could do good things, but usually they don't.
Yeah, Ken, but you can't say either that the workers the 68 was sabotaged. The workers did it for whatever reason. Maybe they were lied to, maybe they weren't, maybe they just didn't, when it came right down to it, maybe they didn't have the strength to continue on, because it's pretty scary, because even if you continue on, what do you end up with? You don't know. So it's kind of like the evil you know or the evil you don't know. I mean, I don't think you can simplify it like that. And I think it's sort of not very productive to kind of divide it like that and, be so negative about the only real organizations that have really ever done anything for workers. It's the money. The money has got to be like, And the only thing now with the digital thing is you can only hope that maybe someday they'll hack the whole banking system. That would throw society into big chaos. Then what would happen? No, the banks didn't know where their money went, or fantasies like that. I'm sure they'd figure it out pretty quick, but there's got to be some solution with the money, because when the money's controlling everything, including politics,
Well, if-
that's the root of it, not the workers. The workers are.
yeah, we'll get into more of the issue of money in the next meeting, in the next chapter. But you're right to point out the importance of that. But the question is, how does one do that? Craig.
Yeah, I think I'm interested in this line of discussion, and without getting into a debate far from the book, what I want to offer is I've been a union member most of my adult life, and unions have saved my job on multiple occasions for being a radical in the workplace. And also, one of the things that I get from the situationist critiques of unions that I have read, and from various Marxist and anarchist critiques that I think has matched my own personal experience, is that the unions can be radical up to a point, but their ultimate function is to make capital flow. They ideally, in a better world, that may not be the case, but I actually don't think unions as such are transformable into a liberatory kind of project that is not that. And so I think that when we're talking about a time when union density is much higher, which it was in the late 60s, and unions have a much more formative role or formal role in so much industry, I think it's harder to see it now. But I will say my experience has been that when workers get radical in the workplace, unions can step in to stop people from getting fired, but unions very often will also make sure workers don't get out of hand in their own organizing. That was my experience being on strike for months when we got very radical tactically, that the union was infuriated behind the scenes about what workers were doing in self-organizing the strike to actually win. And it was also my experience when in various different self-organized experiences on different jobs, where union bureaucrats got very mad if workers weren't respectful, that sort of thing. So I do think there is a real thing to be said about how unions control a certain type of behavior and a certain type of tactical limitation, and what their ultimate function is. I don't think every union is the IWW, and I think it's not helpful to actually mix and match and that, like, the AFL unions could be that kind of union. I actually do not think they could be. They help save some of our jobs, but I don't know that they go much further.
Thank you. Britt?
Yeah, this particular argument goes all the way back to unions accepting collective bargaining. And so that the union is a partner and in what the factory is producing, and they're a partner in making the business work right, which gets in the way of sometime progress or brilliant ideas amongst the workers themselves. I mean, this really goes all the way back. It's even in the Wobbley's preamble that they didn't favor collective bargaining.
Yeah. Actually, I'm going to skip ahead here a little bit to one of the what could have happened in May 1968. And here I'm quoting from the text that De Boer wrote for the Situationists International about May 68. So he's talking about the situation circa May 25th, 1968, where you have all these factories, like 10 million people occupying the factories, but then it's kind of up in the air, like the unions are negotiating with the government and the commerce, the business owners, and they come back with a proposed granting of the workers a large raise and a lot more benefits. And interestingly enough, the workers voted down that agreement that the unions had come up with because they had a sense that much more was on the table than just getting some higher wages and so on. But there was still this period like, okay, what then? The workers have rejected the union deal, but what else? So here's how De Boer put it. If in a single large factory between May 16 and May 30, a General Assembly had constituted itself as a council holding all powers of decision and execution, expelling the bureaucrats, organizing its self-defense, and calling on the strikers of all the enterprises to link up with it. This qualitative step could have immediately brought the movement to the ultimate showdown. A very large number of enterprises would have followed the course thus discovered. Like I say, we have these millions of workers in there waiting for, okay, what next? Now, if they hear that even in one factory, somebody has come up and those factory workers have said, addressing to them, saying, we in our factories have kicked out our union bosses and kicked out the regular bosses, needless to say, and we've formed ourselves as a workers' council. And we're calling on other workers all over France to join us. Well, that, you can imagine that would have been a very different kind of situation than just workers saying, well, what next? And then they're seeing the union people saying, well, keep calm, don't don't rock the boat too much, all this. So this factory could immediately have taken the place of the Sorbonne and so on as being a sort of center of the movement. And become the real center of the occupations movement. Genuine delegates from the different councils could have been elected, and from all the councils and so on, would have rallied around this base. Such an assembly could then have proclaimed the expropriation of all capital, including state capital, announced that all the country's means of production were henceforth the collective property of the proletariat organized in direct democracy, and appealed directly by seizing some of the telecommunications facilities, for example, to the workers of the entire world to support this revolution. Some people will say that such a hypothesis is utopian. We answer, it is precisely because the occupations movement was objectively at several moments only an hour away from such a result that it spread such terror, visible to everyone at the time in the impotence of the state and the panic of the so-called Communist Party, and since then in the conspiracy of silence concerning its gravity. End quote. Anyway, then I go on. So I want to get near the end, and then we can come back to these sort of things. I have terrorism reinforces the state. I said terrorism has often served to break the momentum of radical civil situations. It stuns people, turns them back into spectators anxiously following the latest news and speculations. Far from weakening the state, terrorism seems to confirm the need to strengthen it. If terrorist spectacles fail to spontaneously arise when it needs them, the state itself may produce them by means of provocateurs. And this has happened numerous times. And De Boer and others have written whole books about, cases where that has worked out. And then I go on to talk about the ultimate showdown, and I get back to that May 68 situation. To go back to the May 68 factory occupations, suppose that the French workers had rejected the bureaucratic maneuvers of their unions and established a councilless network throughout the country. What then? And De Boer then goes on, in such an eventuality, civil war would naturally have been inevitable. Armed counter-revolution would certainly have been launched immediately, but it would not have been certain of winning. Some of the troops would obviously have mutinied. The workers would have figured out how to get weapons, and they certainly would not have built any more barricades, a good form of political expression at the beginning of the movement, but obviously ridiculous strategically. Foreign intervention would have inevitably followed, probably beginning with NATO forces, but with the indirect or direct support of the Warsaw Pact. But then everything would once again have hinged on the European proletariat, double or nothing. So this seems pretty extravagant, but it really was that close. And this is, if you really want to do away with money or to do away with, the various other kinds of repressions that we live under, sooner or later, it's going to come down to something like that. And this is just talking about, well, what is going to happen when you do that? So in this particular case, if the workers in France had done this kind of thing, then the issue of money starts going away pretty fast, because a lot of things money can't be used for. If the workers are controlling the factories, even what are the owners of the factories going to do? They can't do anything. If the workers are deciding that they're going to change the factory so it makes different things, or it makes the same things, but the workers are distributing them freely, for example. If the trains and subways are on strike and the workers restart them, but stop charging fares, there's all kinds of things like this that I mentioned here. Judy?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I don't know. I mean, it just seems so romantic to say that you were just hours away from everything being transformed. Maybe if all the workers took over the factories and blah, 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 and then it would continue, and maybe it would be, civil war, etc. Because I got to say, the French are very organized. When they had their revolution in 1789, which was far from perfect, but it was very organized. They had a parliament, they had parties, they had different divisions, they debated, they had laws. They gradually worked up to their place of power where they, kind of got too powerful and got crazy. But it was very organized, the whole procedure. It wasn't like just, didn't happen in a few hours. And I mean, I think that's kind of more how they operate historically, don't you think?
Well, even in those cases, the attack on the Bastille was not organized.
That's true.
And the same people who attacked the Bastille a year earlier were all monarchists, every one of them. In 1788, people weren't saying, let's get rid of the king. They were saying, we're frustrated because the nobles are taxing us too much, or whatever. They had a lot of different grievances. And if you polled them, like at the time, in fact, the government even did poll the people in an effort to sort of make it seem like they were reaching out. And people did complain about hundreds of different things. And they all were in the point, like, the king should do such and such. The king should stop the nobles from doing this or that. you know, and if you had been looking at that, you would have said, boy, this isn't a revolutionary movement, it's a monarchist movement. It's just that they want to moderate things a little bit. Those same people, after repeated rebuffs and outrages and so on, less than a year later, attacked the Bastille. And 3 years later, they cut off the head of the king. And those things were not moving gradually. That may seem
Yeah, but they had a whole procedure. It was a very
the procedure was built out of mobs. Like the reason they could be a parliament was that mobs were protecting the parliament. It's not like that the mobs were waiting for the parliament to do.
That's true, but the parliament did set the precedent. They did make the
They
procedure.
did that, and if the parliament did something that the mobs didn't like, the mobs, you know, it was very chaotic, actually. In retrospect, you could say, oh, they had these different factions and this or that, and they gave speeches and so on. But the actual, I'm just saying, and when you say if these workers had taken over the factories, the workers had already taken over the factories. We're not talking about that. That would be utopian if we say, oh, let's 10 million workers, please take over your factories. De Boer is writing that after the workers on their own did take over the factories. The only question is where from there? They had the power. The army didn't have the power. The army couldn't have done anything about it, or the police, not when you've got all the factories that the country occupied. So the question is, when he says it's an hour away, I don't know, maybe it was 2 hours away or something. He was there and he knew how, I mean, lots of people knew how close the situation was in so many factories to people throwing the unions out and saying, get off that podium, you know, we're here to do something more. So just to say, like, I'm not saying this is some easy thing to do. I'm not giving a formula. I'm just saying that this is what happened then, just like what happened in the free speech movement. It would have been kind of weird to call on everybody to sit around the police, but people just did it. And then it turned out to be a really successful kind of thing. I'd like to call on some more people who haven't talked yet. John, do you have any comments or questions?
Yes, a couple of things. You mentioned on page 65 about the point is not to praise the proletariat, but to abolish it. And then you talk about the class domination hasn't gone away, and white-collar workers, technicians, and even middle-class professionals who formerly prided themselves on their independence, doctors, scientists, scholars, are increasingly subject to the crassest commercialization and even to virtually assembly line style regimentation. So there's been a kind of hollowing out of the middle class. And I wonder, I also want to just jump ahead to something else and then tie the two together. On page 78, you talk about when there's a large demonstration, that the best safety is in numbers. And once thousands of people are openly involved, it hardly matters if a few spies are among them. And my question is, well, I'm thinking back to Mad Magazine, Spy versus Spy, which I used to enjoy. And seeing AI in the situation of the nation state versus revolutionary masses. I can imagine both sides using AI. And just as Lisa made the point about social media and how that is affecting things, and you made the good point if they had the cell phone. However, they could also just cut all the mobile phones like the Iranians have and other, Putin cut something. So, one side does one thing does the other. in this present age, I'm just curious, where you see this kind of AI going with the subject that the joy of revolution. Is the AI going to help our joy?
Oh, AI can go on both either way. I mean, it's just like, does literacy help or not? Both sides are going to use reading. Both sides are going to use logic to some extent, and so on. So as far as cutting off like the cell phones or the internet, like Iran and other countries have sometimes done, you can do that, but try to think about that. If you're trying to run a country, how the hell are you going to run a country under those circumstances? You can drop, maybe for a week or two, maybe you cut off this because you're desperately worried that the masses are going to storm the Capitol or something. But that's not a very functional way to do that. And if you're relying on that, you're in trouble already. I mean, I'm talking about if the state is relying on that. Denny.
A couple things. First of all, I think cutting off cell phones in the US would be a lot more difficult than in Iran or Russia because the control over the technology is not as centralized here as it is in those places. The other thing, this is somewhat trivial and I could have looked it up, but I haven't had a chance. On page 53, you say, yet patriotism has sometimes played a role in triggering radical structures, e.g. Hungary, e.g. Hungary 1956. Could you just say briefly how patriotism came into Hungary 56?
Well, it was Hungary versus the Russian occupation.
Okay.
Russian control.
Okay,
so
I wasn't sure.
Even though there was a workers' thing against bosses and stuff like that, the overall if you looked at it, you would say Hungary, the people in Hungary have sort of quasi overthrown their government. They're leaving Nagy in control, but they're really running it with workers' councils. So in other words, that's Hungary controlled by workers' councils. And then the Russians invade with tanks. And so then even the capitalists, and I mean, practically everybody in Hungary is against that. I mean, in fact, even more right-wing people in Hungary have not been fond of the fact that the Russians were controlling them for a decade. So in that case, you can say, okay, a lot of the oomph for that thing could boil down to, it's just our country. Get the invaders out. But in the case of Hungary, it was also simultaneously a revolution. So I'm just saying that, in other words, patriotism had an element in that.
Okay. Thanks, Ken.
Yeah. Lisa.
I hate to belabor a point, but I wanted to go back to Judy's point about the money. It's not about the money, but it's only about the money. What's the expression? And I was thinking about a revolution we know really well, the American Revolution, and our current state of, a kleptocracy and careening toward, or maybe we're there, fascism. I just think that that's a thread because it's not only a thread in motivating people, but it's also, the disincentive to participate because people are fearful of their economic situation. And you mentioned Hungary, and I think that the Russian occupation was definitely that money or stability was something the Hungarians were worried greatly about. So, I mean, can you comment a little bit about that? Because I think that Judy makes a point by stressing that if, and forgive me, Judy, if I've gotten it wrong, but I think that we can't discount, the nexus of personal stability and personal engagement.
Sure.
That's what I
Yeah.
want to say. Let's
Actually,
talk about that a little bit.
yeah. A little bit earlier in the chapter, when I'm talking about how did these things start, I point out, like, of course, people are usually thinking of their own security, etc. So people aren't just going around normally thinking what would be the ideal society, or they're thinking, how am I going to pay my rent, or whatever. So that goes without saying. The point is that if you put those things together and take a larger view, you can see that everybody in the world is worrying about that. And why are they worrying about that? It's because there's a certain kind of system that says those little pieces of paper mean something. And if you don't have the pieces, if you have those pieces of paper, you own 1 million properties. And if you don't, you're on the street. And, all the irrationalities that involves. Now, that's not an immediate thing. Of course, people have to worry, like, when I go back here, I don't want my money stolen, or I want to still have my house, or I want my family protected, or something like this. But that's always true for any situation. And the people who stormed the Bastille, or the people in the middle, people who have revolted in different times, all faced that kind of thing. It's just that at certain points, either they were so desperate that they just didn't give a fuck, and they just said, I'm just going to go, even if they shoot me down. They've got the machine guns up there, but I'm just so mad and I'm so frustrated, and I say that does sometimes happen. And if it does happen, actually, that can be strategic. If you're the one-man machine gun busing, and you see a whole wave of people coming at you, you say, oh, maybe I better not machine gun all these people, because that's really going to piss, maybe I better just give up or something. But even the point is, there are other means that are more, I don't want to say gradual, but well, maybe gradual is okay, like a strike, for example. And a strike, in most cases, you're not risking your life, although that has happened in the past, or a boycott, or a sit-in, or various things like that. There are things people can do to exert some pressure that don't necessarily involve a lot of risk. The only risk is that you've got to jolt yourself out of your usual habits and say, oh, maybe I'll do this, even though I'm a little bit scared or I'm nervous. And that's the terrain that we work with. If things had been completely logical, we wouldn't be in this system we were in. We would have, hundreds of years ago, we would have been living in a very different society. But in fact, as we know, there's a small number of people in power that inherit a certain system made up of money and buying and selling and so on. And they have an interest in preserving their power. Even though in reality, even they would be better off if we changed things, but they're feared like that they're going to get lynched, if they lose or something. So in what I'm talking about in this book is actually there's I'm talking about, after I talked about the Potemkin scene, I think you all know about that, where the guards are going to shoot the mutineers, and then the mutineers say, comrades, where, brothers, who are you shooting? And the guards, who would be like comparable to the police or the army or something, sort of hesitate, and then the sailors win. But I said, note that even in this violent showdown, the outcome is more a matter of consciousness than of brute power. Once the guards come over to the sailors, the fight is effectively over. In contrast to war, in which two distinct sides consciously oppose each other, quote, and here I'm quoting George Lukács, class struggle is not just a battle waged against an external enemy, the bourgeoisie. It is equally the struggle of the proletariat against itself, against the devastating and degrading effects of the capitalist system on its class consciousness. That's from a book called History and Class Consciousness. And so I go on. Modern revolution has the peculiar quality that the exploited majority automatically wins as soon as it becomes collectively aware of the game it is playing. That's a big if. But it's the proletariat's opponent is ultimately not, and the proletariat is all of us. I mean, it's just like the 99%, let's say. The proletariat's opponent is ultimately nothing but the product of its own alienated activity. Whether in the economic form of capital, like it creates things which the capitalists can then accumulate and etc. The political form of party and union bureaucracies. Both of those things were originally created by radical workers with the intent to liberate themselves. It's just that they didn't turn out to work out that way. They ended up constructing a new kind of ruling order, or the psychological form of spectacular conditioning. The rulers are such a tiny minority that they would be immediately overwhelmed if they had not managed to bamboozle a large portion of the population into identifying with them, or at least into taking their system for granted, and especially into becoming divided against each other, and so on. So while we're in this situation, depending on what countries we live in and maybe even what race we are and so on, we may have more or less danger in speaking out about these things or urging people to do different things. But the point is, I'm not saying do this or don't do that. That's up for people to judge for themselves. But I'm looking at, like, if you want to make these changes, if you're dissatisfied with something about your situation, then look at these things that people have tried in the past, and some of them have partially worked, and some of them have not worked very well. So I'm saying, beware of that thing over there. This thing you might want to try, but as you say, also, the context has changed. Now we've got social media and internet and all these things. So then we'll adjust. Like, what does that mean? And it has good things and bad things. And the point is that to be aware of what's underlying all this, and what's underlying all this is capitalism. It's the particular form of hierarchy or of class society that we live in. It's not monarchy anymore, or slavery or serf feudalism or whatever. But it's a continuation of a few people ruling most of the people. And the form that's taken is this very subtle form called capitalism. It's subtle because it's not just a person with a gun saying, do this or I'll kill you. It's a person being confronted with the fact that, oh, if I don't get a job, how will I feed my family? Well, that's just like pointing a gun at somebody. It's still forcing somebody to do things, but it's more generalized. It's not me saying, give me your money. It's the system saying, one way or the other, you've got to go out there and do this, and you've got to kowtow to the boss, and you've got to follow these things, and so on. Ryan.
So you make a great case about workers and workerism and seizing the means of production to overcome wage labor. But as the rise of what Graeber calls bullshit jobs, the gig economy, decentralized labor, is the workplace still the event site today, or do you see the potential for maybe movements to focus less on occupying formal workplaces? Like I go to suit and tie, occupy there. It's
Right.
they kind of laugh us off.
Yeah. Yeah.
Or maybe even entirely deserting the system and finding alternative, maybe self-sustaining commune structures. So when the spectacular event comes, we're still not going to lose our ability to feed, clothe, and house ourselves.
Okay.
Maybe it's like a dual power argument, maybe.
Yeah. First of all, yes, that bullshit job thing, and I mentioned in the next chapter we'll be looking at 2 weeks from now, which is after a revolution. What would it be like? A lot of these things kind of fall into place, like you say, well, okay, if we didn't have these other things we have to worry about, how would we work things? And so I go into those possibilities. One of the points is with the bullshit jobs kind of thing, I mention in there that a huge amount of present production is bullshit.
Yeah.
I mean, I would say 90%. That's just a rough thing. But in other words, things like insurance, advertising, armies, jails, police, bombs, you know,
Yeah.
you
Production
go
for
on
sake of
and on and
production
on,
in a lot
and
of
all the
cases,
people that work for those people, yeah, you know, there's this huge amount of stuff that are purely designed to prevent you from stealing some bullshit commodity or something that you yourself made.
Yeah.
Okay, so anyway, you're absolutely right. Like and this, the old anarcho-syndicalist kind of notion, like the Wobblies and so on,
Yeah.
sort of implied that most production was worthwhile. I mean, you're producing food and, you know, appliances or,
You know, it was a different time where you're actually,
you know,
creating something.
and so you then in that context, you would say, we don't need much, we just need to adjust, you know, like so that it's distributed more fairly instead of being sold for a higher price so that somebody else can make a profit and buy another factory, et cetera. So yes, and that means that strategically, as you say, it is not so much like it was even 60 years ago in France, let alone a century ago, where you would say the factories. Have the factories, you've got society by the nuts, as they would say. You know, like now, with things being diffused and a lot of the stuff being produced being a more ephemeral kind of thing, like just images or, you know, ideologies or things like that, there are fewer of those leveraged places. There are still some factories that are crucial, and there are some things like transportation and communication that are crucial for everybody, including the rulers. So if you have a strike, you know, that would affect that, yeah. But you're absolutely right. And what's happened later in the book, when we get to the related texts, we can see a movement in France in 2006, which was not consisting of strikes, but consisting of blockages. The things you're talking about, like blocking a freeway or blocking the metros, the subways, or
the
things
bottlenecks,
like
the import sites,
yeah. And so, yeah, we have to be alert to those kind of things where the average person can go out there and have some input, you know, like, and we'll see things like the Occupy movement was of a somewhat different nature, but it's the same sort of, they're responding to that. In other words, the Occupy movement was not mainly strikes, it was just, and it was not even occupying factories, it was just getting out there where there was, everybody knew they were there. and plus at the same time, getting together with other people where you could debate, what is this world we're in? What are we going to do about it? And then a little more recently in France, the Gilets jaunes movement, the Yellow Jackets. I won't go into this, but that was another movement that was not in strike, but they would get at intersections, and kind of block them and make a big, raise a lot of shit, and say, hey, we're pissed off, prices are going up. It wasn't even necessarily left wing. It was just sort of a general dissatisfaction with things.
And I see some of the books from France currently, like Tikkun, Invisible Committee, some of this more biopolitic argument of, well, you got to put the infrastructure in should that grand, spectacular piercing of the veil come through. We're still going to have to feed and clothe and house as many people as possible.
Yeah.
And since the United States, for example, doesn't really produce anything except bullshit jobs on many occasions, once the factories and the boats stop coming, having some kind of material basis to keep it afloat seems to be a big part of, but maybe I'm jumping ahead to chapters to come.
You're actually, without knowing it, you're jumping ahead to a book that I'm working on right now, which is by Kenneth Rexroth, my other big influence. He wrote a book called Communalism. This is the original cover, back in 1974, Communalism from its origins to the 20th century, which was a history of various movements, everything from primitive communism to millenarian revolts in the Middle Ages and the Diggers and the English Revolution and 19th century utopian communities in America, up through the 1960s counterculture communes. And he actually, again, I don't want to go there, but
Yeah.
he actually, the whole book is talking about how did they work? And of course, a lot of them were farces. They didn't work, they fell apart. A few of them worked pretty well. And he says, why did these work well and these didn't? So he goes into that in some detail. But my take on that, although it's very interesting, and this is why I'm getting it published again, is that in general, yeah, you can do stuff like that if you want, but I would not rely on that to amount to, I mean, it's a positive thing if you're growing your own food and all this kind of
Yeah.
stuff. But I wouldn't want to say, oh, that's what the new world is going to be based on, because you can do a whole lot of that and it's not going to counteract one war.
Yeah,
I mean, we have the thing right now, like, Trump could start a new nuclear war. I mean, I don't know that it's likely, but we definitely, anybody must have thought about the thing. And what is all this other, there's an urgent need to address the whole system. You can't just go away and think that it's going to
Yeah,
fold
just
up.
deserting's not gonna topple the
No,
empire.
and in the unlikely case that your country commune was a threat, they would just wipe it out and arrest everybody. It's not as if you're going to be able to hold off a foreign invasion,
At least it gets away from the bullshit job and the 9-to-5 grind and not having the time
Yeah,
to
so
organize. But it's only a part of the story.
This is the thing, like each of us is trying to find their own way to do the best we can within the ridiculous circumstances we find ourselves in. But again, that's part of the discussion, is what you're bringing up. Like I mean, by no means am I dissing that.
Yeah.
Because I mean, that's a favorable thing that some people want to do. But you have to be aware that a lot of them have failed. I mean, people were trying that massively in the 60s and most of them didn't work.
Yeah.
And when all the land is getting bought up by big agro business, and so, yeah, you end up in a place like, it's like co-ops in the city. Fine. I mean, I shop at some of them, and get some, we have a co-op pizza cheese place in Berkeley that's great. And they produce good food. And when you go there, the workers are highly paid and they look a lot happier and all that, but they still have to operate it as a business. So in other words, it's not a big step there. It's just a make do, like that this may be a little more pleasant or a little more secure than depending on some more alien form.
Well, I look to the next chapters and how you go that route and I'm going to look up Rexloff, but
Yeah.
it was more just jumping ahead because Judy's question about money kept bringing me back to that kind of question.
That's right. So we get to the point, like, as I say, in the first chapter, I say, I think that to quote myself, what is needed, I believe, is a worldwide participatory democracy revolution that would abolish both capitalism and the state. That is admittedly a big order. And I'm not saying it's going to happen. But I'm afraid that nothing less can get to the root of our problems. It may seem absurd to talk about revolution, but all the alternatives assume the continuation of the present system, which is even more absurd. So part of these first 3 chapters are talking about ways of getting there, things that have failed and things that have partially succeeded or that show promise and so on. And then chapter 4, which we'll look at next meeting 2 weeks from now, is like, let's assume that we did do the kind of thing that I'm talking about. We actually won globally, not just in one country, so that we don't have to worry about Franco people coming in to destroy our country peasant communes or whatever. And then I'm looking at how would it work? And mostly I'm looking at how it would work in the first decade or 2. Because as I mentioned, like past that, who the hell knows? But the point is, in an immediate future, if we're saying, okay, we've knocked out the state thing. There's no standing army. The police are running, trying to hide themselves, for fear of revenge and all this. And so we're here now. What do we do with what we've got? And so then I go into different things. Okay, like, do we redesign the cities? How do we redesign living places? What do we do about homeless people? Okay, well, first of all, we might do da-da-da. And then we, probably there would be different stages, where we would build new homes for people. What do we do about da-da-da? People in bullshit jobs. What do the people in bullshit jobs do? Well, let's say it's 90% of the working people, roughly. We then, all the things that we think do need to be done, like providing food, getting the transportation and communications back up, if they've been destroyed in the revolution or whatever. And then other things like education or, just things that people decide they want or need. And we decide how to do that. Okay, we need X number of product such and such. Okay, right now, product such and such is being made by this small number of people. So let's bring over some of these people who used to work in ad departments or lawyers' offices or, whatever, and incorporate them in this. And because most of these things are bullshit, it's not like everybody has to suddenly work 100 hours a week. They're more likely working 10 or 20 hours a week, because we've just suddenly stopped doing all these bullshit jobs. And so the people in them can help out in the non-bullshit jobs. And so I'm looking into that. And then you said, well, what about money? And I say, well, I have a couple chapters about that. how, how do we do without money? What do you do in place of money if you want to exchange things? Or things, obviously, everything can't be immediately free for everybody, but a lot of things could be immediately free almost instantaneously. And then you figure out things that you don't have that, and you try to work toward a situation like, oh, it would be nice if everybody could also have this thing, even though we don't have a lot of them at the moment. So then you have, new factories or new work things to do those. But who's going to work in those factories? It's most of these things are volunteer things. So then you have to be, how are we going to reorganize this thing so it's more fun? It's less dangerous. It's more comradely or friendly to work there, and so on. How do we change the schools so they're more blah, blah, blah. And anyway, there's a whole lot of different issues like this that we'll go into in that final chapter. And of course, that's just a little hint of, I'm just trying to address some kind of issues that people raise when they say, oh, that's impossible. People will never do that. Most people assume that we have to have money. In fact, they don't even assume that. They think money is something that exists like air. and that what would you do if you didn't have money? Everybody would starve. Well, it doesn't work that way. People didn't starve before they had money. So are they Kim, we haven't heard from you.
Well, I noticed that the next chapter is called Rebirth. It's not called Birth. And this chapter is called Climaxes. I was very interested in the British Columbia telephone takeover.
Yeah.
And the woman whose diary was published
Yeah.
that you reference.
Right.
It says, we're all flying, sailing on pure adrenaline.
Right.
And I looked up the article, and on day 4, it says, finally, we get to see what other operators' jobs entail. Everyone agrees we're doing just fine without management. No speed ups, signs blinking on a video screen. Instead of speed up, please, our messages read solidarity forever. We shall overcome, and good morning, TWUers. We're doing great. We are the workers. So there's this thrill to it. But in so many of the other stories that you delineate in the chapter, you get very close, like the situationist, the May 68, but it doesn't quite get there. So I started thinking this is more like coitus interruptus than climaxes.
Yeah, often it has been that, unfortunately. Yeah, the rebirth thing, I was just sort of playing around with the sexual thing, and well, what comes after the
but I thought one of the
Renaissance, literally, so I'm just saying, okay, we're founding a new world.
But one of your, I mean, you've already covered this a little bit, but you had a sentence, a radical situation must spread or fail. So I think that's very important to keep in mind.
Yeah. And that ties in with the internationalism and so on. Like, you can't just sit there and expect that the ruling society is going to let you. They're going to send in infiltrators, or they're going to, whatever. They'll do something. So the only choice is just to keep expanding so that it's out of their control. I'll read a little bit more about that thing that Kim was reading from. In February 1981, 11,000 telephone workers occupied exchanges throughout British Columbia and carried on all phone services without charge for 6 days before being maneuvered out by their union. Besides winning many of their demands, they seem to have had a delightful time. And here's a quote from that woman who wrote that article. One day into this thing, and I'm tired, but compared to the positive sensations that are passing through this place, fatigue doesn't stand a chance. Who will ever forget the look on management's faces when we tell them we are now in control and their services are obviously no longer needed? Everything is normal, except we don't collect phone bills. In other words, they're keeping the phones running,
But no money.
Yeah. We're also making friends from other departments. Guys from downstairs are coming up to help and learn our jobs. We're all flying, sailing on pure adrenaline. It's like we own the bloody thing. The sign on the front door says, Co-op Tel, under new management, no management allowed. So when you get some of these things, like you say, some of them are coitus interrupted, but here's another earlier thing from the 1919 Seattle general strike. And this is the strikers speaking for themselves in their own publication. They're talking about the beginning of the strike. So here, like, we are going on strike starting tomorrow and blah, blah, blah. Labor will not only shut down the industries, but labor will reopen under the management of the appropriate trades such activities as are needed to preserve public health and public peace. If the strike continues, labor may feel led to avoid public suffering by reopening more and more activities under its own management. Those are in all capitals. And that is why we say we are starting on a road that leads no one knows where. Okay, I mean, these are like the high points. And and I would say these are not delusions. It's not like, yeah, they didn't succeed. I mean, the strike was over in a week or, whatever, or they only partially did. But they were not deluded. We are deluded. The kind of people that are sitting around saying, oh, that's not realistic, or who would ever do that? So I think that kind of tone, that mood, which I have sensed a little bit in the 60s and a lot in the Occupy movement, and like Mike mentioned, radical situations he had been in before and so on. These things do come up, and when they come up, it's like taking LSD. After you've taken it, you're never the same again. You can conclude that, okay, I've had enough psychedelics. I'm not going to, it has its dangers or this or that. But you've been someplace and you've seen it. And so when you've been in these situations, you know how people can be when they spontaneously, joyfully come together to deal with a situation they're all concerned with, without the usual things about worrying about money or about, this or that. And to me, that's a hint of what a society can be like. And that's what I talk about in chapter 4. So let's see, I'd like to, Gerhard, any comments or questions from you?
Yeah, hi, Ken. Thank you. I'm really taken with this question that Kim came up with, which is how you thought through this book in terms of your experience in life and your other work. And I was thinking so much of how you came up with these headings that do have that metaphoric sexual sense. And I'm wondering, is that tied somewhat to your looking at Reich's work, Wilhelm Reich? And the other thing I'm wondering about is this sort of open-ended? I mean, you revised it here. I'm guessing you wrote most of this in some months 10 years ago, and then have been returning to it and decided to update it. And you got the new things from your experiences with the free speech movement and the Occupy people. Is this like an ongoing catalog? Because I think of things like consumer supported agriculture, CSAs, where the means of production of food is in the hands of members who support families. We've been doing that for 10 years here, very successfully. I'm thinking about the things like critical mass and the bicyclists that have shown the whole Bay Area, both sides of the Bay, and particularly here in the East Bay, that you cannot stop bicyclists from doing when you've reached a certain critical mass, they're going to have their way. And, I wish that we could sit down and have a session where you just walked us through how you put this book together.
Well, to start with that last thing, Danny Grobani and I are friends with the guy who started Critical Mass back about 40 years ago or whenever it was, Chris Carlson in San Francisco. So as far as the chronological thing, I started writing notes about this topic of revolution 40 or 50 years ago, back when I was doing some other stuff, but I would just occasionally jot down little things like, oh, strategically, this doesn't work, or a little slogan or a little twist, something. And I just accumulated notes like that for about 10 or 15 years, like mainly in the 80s and early 90s. And then a little on into the 90s, I got to a point where I thought, I'm going to put this thing together. And actually, right around that same time in 1993, I also started writing an autobiography, and mostly the situationist stuff. And so once I started writing that, then that kind of funneled off a lot of specific things in my life, like with different situationist people, and how I met the situationists and all these things. And so that kind of organized that in terms of what I had lived through. And then these other things on revolution could be a little bit more objective, like a little more general. And I could decide, does this go in the autobiography or in Joy of Revolution, and so on. So when I came out with Public Secrets, this book, that was 1997, and the first chapter of Public Secrets was The Joy of Revolution. And then the next chapter was the autobiography, and then I had my earlier pamphlets and articles and stuff like that. So as far as I'm concerned, I wrote The Joy of Revolution trying to be so general that it would not be dated for a long time. And I think I succeeded pretty much. Like, even at the time, the internet was just barely starting around then, and I had a computer, but I didn't have an internet connection till 1998. But I knew it was there, and some people said, so you see a few mentions of the internet or things like that, like I talk about computer networks and so on in here. But actually, this new version of it is basically identical to the 1997 one. The only changes are the little end notes. So all the other stuff is just the same as from 1997. But I would have updated it more had I felt the need to, but I didn't. I think that all the things I say there are still pretty spot on. And it's just that they're supplemented by my more recent things, like about the Occupy movement or about that French movement or about Trump and things like that have happened since then. So yeah, in those later cases, I take into account, obviously, the internet and that kind of stuff a lot more. But the book itself it's almost 30 years, it's 29 years ago. And that's what we're reading right now.
And it holds up well.
Thank you. Let's see here. Ed Barcelone, do you have any comments or questions?
I just posted a few comments and questions in the chat,
Oh,
but I don't know. You can go through them if you want, but I don't know if like we have like.
well, if there's one or two things in particular you'd like to mention, doesn't.
But I found very interesting the Ryan's question, and it's like in the comment I was asking like how pivotal are workers in the current capitalist system, and is the proletariat still to be defined as the vast majority of workers who have lost all power over their lives?
Well, that seems like a pretty good definition to me, because it's I mean, actually, that's true of, like the Occupy movement says, like 99% of us pretty much, regardless of what kind of work we do, assuming that we even work and are not just homeless people or something. The difference is that some of the things that, you know, the classical things about wage labor and commodity production still apply because that's the kind of society we're in. It's just that there are fewer workers than there were back in Marx's day, where the majority of people were in factories, or they were farmers if they weren't in factories or something like that. So we have to, as far as strategically, we have to think that it's not just like the IWW might have thought, like general strike. And I think that general strike, kind of broadly interpreted, is still a good idea. But some more modern people have referred to what they call a social strike, which is maybe a little bit more what you're talking about, where it doesn't worker smirker, you know, whoever it is, there's just a lot of people that get together to try to impact, you know, like to blockade some dictator or, you know, some company or something like this. And it may be that there are fewer situations where you're in a factory. It may be that, but so then we look at some of these other possibilities, like, you know, blocking transportation systems or communications or stuff like that. I don't know. But I think that we all find ourselves in this situation where fundamentally we have very little control over our lives. Yeah, some of us have some control, like, yeah, we've got enough money that we can pay the rent and, you know, we can afford to go to a restaurant or, you know, do a few things. But even that's at the cost of having a lot of strain and maybe working at things that we don't like to do and so on. And it's visible, it's even more visible than ever before. Like if somebody can be a trillionaire, that's so ridiculous. I mean, that far surpasses like being an emperor of Persia or something like that in power. And it's so irrational. And that's just because that guy got his money from the capitalist system. You know, he didn't just point a gun and say, give me your money. He got it because by manipulating stocks and, you know, bribing politicians and all these things. So we have that same ridiculous system that has been there, and it's just been pushed to more extreme examples. And so I don't particularly care if you use the term proletariat or not. I mean, so what? You can just say the people. But the point is that you're talking about the mass number of people that have little or no power over their lives versus just a tiny percentage of people at the top, who even themselves, they aren't really in control. They think they're in control, but they're, as we've seen, a lot of them are such complete goofs. They don't even know what the hell they're doing. You know, they're off on this trip, you know, that they have $50 billion and they're desperate to make it $100 billion, you know, it's completely meaningless. So the system is more self-evidently stupid and irrational than it was even back in Marx's time. So I think much of the same logic applies, that we need, if we're going to get out of the system, we have to overcome that capitalist commodity wage labor kind of thing, because that's at the underpinning of the whole thing. If that went away, there really would hardly be any obstacle to doing whatever we wanted to do. But because that's in power, then it tries to stay in power by propaganda or dominating the internet or et cetera. So I guess
Thank you.
that's, yeah. Any other comments or questions?
I would just like to say my favorite sentence in the whole reading was this one. Americans own so many commodities that they fail to notice that someone else owns the whole society. Thank you for that one.
Thank you. So I'll be sending you out an email tomorrow, but basically we'll just be reading chapter 4 of this book, the final chapter of Joy of Revolution, before we get to the related texts. And so I'll look forward, thank you for your comments and questions, and I'll look forward to seeing you then. Bring your friends if you want, and thanks again.
Thanks, Ken.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Ken.
Thanks.
Here I will, let's see what we pause the